Uh, this is Jay Rezepepe, City Council member, City of Port Orchard. This is a meeting of the Land Use Committee on July 8th, 2021, 4:30 p.m. In attendance are Jay Rezepepe, City Council member. We want to go around the room real quick.
Scott Diener, council member.
Fred Chang, council member.
Nick Bond, Community Development Director.
Carrie Salee, Long Range Planner.
And we have an agenda, but before we start the agenda, we want to look at our calendars for next month's meeting.
And we have enough items that it doesn't necessarily have to be next month. It could be the end of this month or next month. I know it's been hard to get a meeting scheduled for a little while.
The date that we had tried to set, starting from the beginning of the year, was the first Thursday of each month, but it seems like that hasn't worked out very well for some people. So I don't know if you just want to change that date from now on or try to revert back to it.
Let's revert for the next one or see what people do on August.
August 5th would be good for me.
I'm going to be on an airplane that day going to a wedding, but Carrie can go without me.
Can't you zoom into the wedding? Would it be a lot cheaper?
Probably.
Scott, does August? Go
I
ahead.
can do August 5th.
We have a lot of issues, Nick, that have been piling up. I don't know if you really want me to be the only person in that meeting. A lot of these are current planning issues too.
Let me see what time my flight is that day. I think it's pretty early.
Well, I was wondering if August 4th would work. It's a Wednesday.
Or July 29.
Yeah, the morning of the 5th does not work for me. The 4th, I could potentially make that work. Let me look at my calendar for, let's see here. August 4th. Are you thinking late afternoon or morning?
I would prefer late after,
Like
the 4:30 meeting, but
I have to be up in Seattle by 7, which means I need to be on the road by probably quarter to 6. So if we could start at 4, I could probably make that date work.
August 4th and 4th. August 4th at 4.
August 4th at 4 would work for me. Scott?
Yeah, it works for me.
Carrie?
Absolutely. August 4th at 4 p.m.
Right.
Okay.
Hey, that wasn't so bad.
That was scarily easy. Thank you.
Yeah, everybody better double check it.
I'm in town.
All right.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, let's start the agenda.
Hey, Carrie, are there any policies on our committees that the city has? Nick, do you know of any policies that we have on committee operations?
I mean, if we do, it seems like they would be in the Title II of our code, and I'm looking there right now.
What are you thinking there, Scott?
Well, I just, sometimes we get wrapped up on a date because one of us can't attend. And I'm just wondering if there's a policy that says all 3 council members need to be in attendance, or if we should just accept that, there might be a meeting every now and then where somebody can't attend, and as long as we have a quorum, we should be able to hold that meeting. I know that we discourage that, but I just wondering if that's because of policies, but
No,
I've never seen any.
I've been in meetings with just 2 of us, a quorum.
And other committees often find substitutes to attend the meeting on their behalf. So if somebody can't make a land use committee meeting, you could ask one of the other council members to fill in.
We thought Fred was not able to come today, and we were planning to meet with just the 2 of you, Jay and Scott. We thought that was a quorum, so that was acceptable.
Okay. All right. So if we have anything, it'll be entitled to, you said?
Nick, you've muted yourself.
Yeah, I'm looking through there now and I don't see anything concerning committees, but it may be in a subsection of one of these chapters that I haven't located yet.
I just thought I would try and learn if there was something so that I know a little bit more about what our rules are. But okay, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you everyone for making the time to be here today. I know it's been difficult the last month or 6 weeks to get everybody here with your busy schedules and it being summer and so forth, so we appreciate it. This is kind of an abbreviated agenda. We just wanted to bring the few items to you today that were the most urgent to have your advisement on. We do have other items, but we will deal with those on August 4th. So these are the ones that we just needed to have your input on, because these do require us to take some action in the next month or two, based upon deadlines that are kind of coming up for us or urgency for the applicant. So moving into the first one, we have some things that are kind of being put on us by recent action from the state legislature, which have to do with affordable housing, transitory housing, and homeless shelters. And basically summing this up, in 2019, the legislature passed a requirement that cities may not prohibit permanent supportive housing in any areas where multifamily housing is permitted. We actually didn't know about that. So for the last couple of years, our zoning code has been out of compliance because we weren't aware of that requirement. But this year, the legislature added some additional language to that section. Now that section says that a city shall not prohibit transitional housing or permanent supportive housing in any zone in which residential dwelling units or hotels are allowed. So we need to go ahead and update our zoning code to reflect those requirements from the state. I included a handout also in this packet that includes the state definitions of what transitional housing and permanent supportive housing are. Permanent supportive housing can be something as simple as there is a state or local program which is helping you to acquire through lease housing where otherwise you would not be able to acquire it on your own due to you have a past history of substance abuse or criminal history and so forth. It doesn't mean that it's housing specially built for that purpose. So it's simply that there's a program that you're working through that's helping you get into housing. It could be an apartment, it could be a house, it could be something, it could be a halfway house, but more likely it's simply getting you into regular community housing. So that's what permanent supportive housing is. Transitional housing is generally more of a purpose-built facility that provides housing and supportive services to homeless persons or families for up to 2 years. And that's intended to help you get back on your feet. It facilitates the movement of homeless persons and families back into independent living. So we are no longer allowed to prohibit either of those types of housing in any zone in which we allow residential dwelling units or hotels. So we need to go ahead and put that into our land use table. And we're basically just letting you know that we have a proposal in our land use table to allow those in there. What we've done is to say that transitional housing is a conditional use, because that is generally going to be a facility, not a house or an apartment, but something that's actually purpose-built, a larger facility perhaps, or some type of multi-unit development. It could even be something that looks like congregate living, but it won't be. But it's something that will have more of an institutional type nature. So we would like to make that a conditional use so that the city has the opportunity to fully review the impacts of that type of development on the surrounding development and the neighborhood and any impacts that it could have. And that if there are any impacts, that they can be appropriately mitigated. Permanent supportive housing, because of its nature, is really less of an, it wouldn't be expected to have any impacts that we could ask for mitigation, because it's simply that people are going through a program to get them into regular housing. So we're proposing that that would just be straight out permitted in all zones where housing and hotels are allowed, because it's simply that people are going through a subsidized or supportive program to get them into regular housing just like everybody else. In other words, you wouldn't really know that your next door neighbor is working with a permanent supportive housing program. Does that make sense to everybody? Do you have any questions about that so far?
A lot of questions, but
Okay.
why don't you finish? Do you want to go? Do you want to continue?
I'd rather get the questions answered if you don't mind, because it may help.
Okay.
someone.
Yeah.
So if I could paraphrase, it sounds like there is not a lot of discretion for the city to prohibit transitional or permanent supportive housing in any residential area. Is that correct?
That is absolutely correct. We cannot prohibit it. We have the ability to put some conditions on it. And it, reasonable occupancy, intensity of use, spacing. In other words, you can say, well, you can't have 5, transitional housing facilities on one block and things like that. But you may not prohibit them in any zone. We have no choice about that.
Okay. What would something like the tiny homes be considered? Would that be considered congregate living?
No,
Or is
no,
that transitional?
neither necessarily. A tiny home is simply a small house. And if you have a small home on a lot, or if it's something that fits our qualifications for cottage type housing, or we have other potential solutions that we're working on for common ownership, where you have houses that are associated with one piece of property, but you have individual homes. None of that would be considered transitional or shelter or supportive housing, unless that's the format that the program is putting the people into. So that's two separate things, I believe, Fred.
So just so I understand, under the definition of transitional housing, if there were tiny homes and they met density, we would argue that it's not transitional housing if it otherwise met the purpose of providing supportive and housing services to homeless people.
If a transitional housing program said that we are going to build a facility that is made up of tiny homes, and we're going to put homeless people and their families in it for up to 2 years, and the purpose of this facility is to get them back on their feet in independent living out of these homes within 2 years, that's right, we can't prohibit it.
Okay.
Now, what we could do is, I don't think we could, and Nick, contradict me if you think I'm saying the wrong thing, but I don't think we could just say that because it's in a tiny home format, we hate tiny homes and we're not going to allow it. If we allow tiny homes somewhere else, we can't say that because it's in we can't say because it's in a transitional housing facility that we won't allow it if we allow it somewhere else, provided that the impacts are mitigated in the same way that they would be anywhere else, because it would be a conditional use.
But I gotta look.
I think the one distinction is that because we've adopted a form-based code and because our zoning code allows detached houses as a building type, and you have to have one detached house per lot, I think there's potentially some issues there in terms of building form versus use. So what we're talking about is a land use, not a building type. So you have to have an approved building type in which where the use can locate.
But if they want to do like a cottage court type development,
Right.
and the zoning is appropriate for that, and they want to do it as tiny homes, but say this is transitional housing, then I don't believe that we would have the ability to say no to that, although we could make it a conditional use.
Right. Yeah, it's a gray area for sure when it comes to building types.
So my question was, where you talked about we couldn't prohibit transitional housing in our code. We hadn't prohibited it as such directly, had we?
We were silent on it.
That's what I thought.
Allow it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but we
Yeah,
were silent on as opposed to embracing it.
Right. And if
Well-
you look at our land use code under the use tables, it says if a use is not specifically mentioned, that the director has to make a determination as to whether it is or is
Right.
not permitted. And then if we make that determination, we have to bring forward a code amendment within 1 year to codify it. So technically, if somebody brought this in, I would have the ability to say, yes, that's permitted, but this is it. That's not a decision I want to be in the position of making. I would rather have you make that decision.
So you'd rather have us make it a P instead of a C? If you're
Um,
talking to the table?
For permanent supportive housing, I believe it makes sense that that be a P, because really we aren't going to see applications for permanent supportive housing because it's simply helping people get into apartments or houses that already exist. It's a program, really. It's not a building type or a building form. With transitional housing, it's intended to be a facility that's built and provided. So yes, we would be seeing those applications. So I think in that case, it needs to be a conditional use.
I follow that logic. I'm supportive of it.
I think
And-
there's gonna be a lot of questions at the council.
think
I'm
there will
supportive
be.
too, but I think our only option is whether it would be a P or a C. And I agree that it would be nice to have some say to mitigate some of the effects. So I'm more comfortable with it being a C, I guess, for transitional housing, as opposed to
Mhm.
being an outright P for permitted. But this does raise the question of in any residential zone. I mean, what if a residential zone has HOAs?
There's
And
nothing that we
that's
can
a
do at the
theoretical
city
question. We
level.
don't need to go down there now, but I'm just thinking that this is going to be very interesting to watch.
Yeah, that's a
Well-
civil issue that the city wouldn't get involved with.
Yeah, 'cause we don't enforce HOA rules right now. That's a civil matter between those particular parties within the HOA. The city doesn't take sides or get involved with that at all. So that will continue to be the case, and we simply have to enforce state law.
So I can relate from experience that in my county role, there's been issues with permanent supportive housing where an organization has taken over a house and has made that available and has kind of stacked them and racked them. And what this meant in this particular instance I'm thinking of, in a tight cul-de-sac area, was that there was a lot of haphazardly parked cars. And there was a lot of complaints generated just because of the volume of people that were living in the house. And they didn't always get along, just by nature of having different backgrounds and outlooks on life and, maybe different influences. But so my question here is, under the definition that we have, how do we monitor the actual, and I don't mean density in the traditional term, but density of rooms and occupants in a house, in a permanent supportive facility, so that it's not become more of a boarding house type facility?
That's a really good question, and I don't know the answer to that because from what I understand, there's no permit that they would have to come to the city for in order to rent a house or to rent an apartment. You're simply helping a client rent a place to live. And so,
With that said, though, I think there is room because we list the land uses in the parking code. I mean, if we wanted to have parking standards that said that for permanent supportive housing, you need one parking stall per resident, that we could absolutely also bring forward a corresponding amendment to the parking code.
But not each resident may have a car.
Well, yeah, and I'm throwing out one per resident, but it may be less than that, but that at least puts some limit on how many people you can pack into a house if there isn't adequate parking.
I think we might be better off relying on general occupancy limits. Otherwise, I think we're going to be open to some kind of charge of discrimination that we're putting tighter parking requirements on a certain type of occupancy rather than what's safe or what is needed in the neighborhood.
And there are neighborhoods that already have parking problems within the same family, like Sage Court. I'm sure there are many other areas, but Kitsap Homes of Compassion is doing this model. They rent a home and they rent it to unrelated persons, and I think the city has not monitored whether the people living in a residence are related or not. But for some reason, the county has had, or I've heard mention of it, and Scott, you may know more about it, where you can't have more than X number of unrelated people in a residence. I don't know how they would even begin to enforce that?
I haven't heard that approach. What I've heard is that there have been fire marshal concerns about how some of the homes have been used with their occupancy, and some of the space has been converted for occupancy, garages, for example. But the complaints that come from those situations are usually involving noise and cars.
And it seems like most of those could be dealt with as regular code enforcement complaints, parking on the street, unlicensed vehicles, noise. And I think we have to deal with them in the same way that we deal with anybody else who would be renting a house. I'm not an attorney, but it seems like we shouldn't be putting something into our code that discriminates against how those people got into that house. Because that's exactly what this is trying to say, is you cannot discriminate against these type of people any longer.
Yeah, I support that. But what if you were to look at something like supportive housing for 6 occupants or less, not including caretaker or service providers, would be a P, but for 7 or more would require a C.
Mhm.
So I will say that there was a bill in 2020, it was Senate Bill 6302, and the state tried to pass a statutory limit restricting local governments from imposing limits on unrelated people living together. It did not pass, which leads me to believe that we can do this, but those sorts of things are frowned upon, and it may become something we would have to change in the future.
Do we know anything from our neighbor cities?
Everybody's trying to respond to this in relatively short order. I don't know of anyone who's actually adopted something to comply with this law yet.
I think for me, and just speaking for me, I understand about the discriminatory aspects of what we're talking about, but I do share the concern of I think Scott's comment of rack 'em and stack 'em, that there is a certain health and sanitation issue, or could be, depending on how many people are in a house or utilizing the house. I don't have an answer.
Right. And, along those same lines, we're talking about our water and sewer connection fees. If you're operating this type of thing where you have significantly more people living in a building than what is typical of a house or some other building, there may be major sewer or water impacts on the in terms of ERUs.
So what I'm hearing is that maybe we want to have it permanent supportive housing permitted up to a certain occupancy level, maybe 6, and then after that, it should be a C. The issue is how we will ever know that an apartment or a house is being rented for that purpose, I think.
Well, there should be, for those facilities, annual fire checks, right?
It's just an apartment or a house. It's just a regular,
The fire district does annual inspections on existing apartment buildings. They would not do it on houses unless it was on their radar. So I'm not sure that they would actually get around to a single family house that was being rented out in this way.
There may be
Because
houses that are already doing this that we don't know about.
that could be, because again, we were prohibited from doing this a couple of years ago, which we just didn't know.
So
Seems like
you guys-
we're kind of in a circular discussion right now. How do we address the issue, or what guidance are you looking for from the committee?
I personally, I think Carrie's suggestion that we make a distinction that 6 or less is permitted and anything above 6 is conditional use. I think that's consistent with our approach to group homes, or I guess group home, the cutoff is 8 residents. And then once you're above, once you're 9 or more, it becomes a conditional use in certain zones.
I would support Scott's suggestion to have it be more than 6, because we're talking about people going into generally a a standard neighborhood, residential neighborhood, not a purpose-built group home.
Right.
Okay. So therefore less is more, so to speak,
I think so.
opposed to a group home where it's supervised.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay, I'll give a thumbs up on that one.
I'm going to give a thumbs down because I don't know how we wouldn't even know how many people are going to live in a house just because it has 5 bedrooms.
Well, I don't think we need to know unless it becomes a problem and then it's something that can be enforced.
Yeah,
And then it's not saying that it's prohibited, because obviously it can't be, but then it's like, hey, you've got 12 people living here and you're taking up the entire street with parking and the noise or the litter has become a problem. It would actually be a code enforcement issue like any place else. It's just we have this additional tool to use to get their compliance, I think.
Fred, are
Yep.
you thinking it should be a C across the board?
no, you mean for permanent supportive housing?
Yeah.
No,
Okay.
no. I'm not.
You're just concerned about how we're gonna know whether we're being gamed or not.
Well, yeah, I mean, the reason I don't support it is because I think it sounds a little too Big Brother, where and I heard what you said, Carrie, that it's not the only thing that we would enforce. It's just another tool that if they're breaking, parking or noise, and it's like, oh, and by the way, and they have too many people in the house who are unrelated. And I don't think we care if they're unrelated or not. I mean, we can't go down there. We really can't. But I don't. Yeah, I would reluctantly not support that.
So what about the parking? What
I-
about
I
the
would-
parking code standard if we wanted to have parking standards, if there are more than 6 occupants that you have a different
That I
parking?
think we need to enforce the parking and the noise. I think we should do that with with the populations that we already have. And I don't know if we can, like if there's one house that has 17 cars, I don't know if we can do anything about that now if it's just a family of 4. To me, that's
Oh.
more obnoxious than 12 people, it's
Nick, you're thinking of a footnote to the P.
Well, no, I would just say P, and then I would add in chapter 20.124, there's a table that lists all of the uses. And so for a single family detached use, you need 2 parking stalls. And I think we would just add the permanent supportive housing and to that list and say that permanent supportive housing, the requirement is this many stalls, 2 stalls, and if you have more than 6 residents, it's 1 additional stall for each resident or something like that. to keep-
Except that permanent supportive housing can also be in an apartment building.
Mhm. Right, so we would need to figure out some way to write a parking standard for the use. But I think then we at least have a codified mechanism, because noise we can enforce under our nuisance code. We already have a tool if somebody is violating the noise ordinance that we can enforce. If there isn't enough parking, in the absence of it being a conditional use permit, in the absence, you would have to have a parking standard. Otherwise, what are you going to enforce if there's a problem? So I think it either needs to be a conditional use where you sort of have a catch-all tool to address problems that would arise, or you need to have a specific standard for the use, which would mean amending our parking code for for these new uses that are being added to the land use table,
Or maybe both.
or maybe both.
Do you see an upper limit to how many people could be in a facility?
We have the ability to apply that. We can, as the MRSC guidance says, we do have the ability to limit it to, quote, reasonable occupancy. There's no definition of reasonable.
Yeah.
Okay.
I still like Scott's first one just because it gives us an additional tool in our toolbox. I understand your concern, Fred. Since we're not talking family members, I think it adds another dynamic.
One interesting wrinkle is if you're counting the number of people living in a house, what if they're minors, who always aren't driving versus adults? Is there any way we can make a distinction with the number of adults in a house as opposed to minors? I don't know.
It's easier to do with a conditional use permit to provide that flexibility, I think, than with a rigid standard.
Okay.
I personally think it's reasonable to say that 6 or less, by virtue of being a P, we're not expecting the impacts that we might get from 7 or more. And that to address or mitigate those impacts, that a C is not inappropriate. We're gonna have trouble trying to find every loophole and close it.
I think this is also something that's going to keep evolving.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And we'll have a chance to look at this if it gets out of control.
Can you
Would you
live with
be
that,
able-
Fred?
Yeah, actually, I think the whole thing is a step forward. If we made it all Cs, that's still better than what we had, in a sense, I think, so.
Well, we weren't proposing all Cs, just for 7 or more occupants.
That sounds good.
And
Could you live with that, Fred, then if we revised what we have here so that 7 or more is Cs, and maybe if we also did some notes to our parking standards, and that was how it went for a work study discussion?
I think that would be,
and I think an occupant has to include if there's a live-in caretaker. Because.
Agreed.
well, that would be one of the residents, right? So,
Yeah.
All right, and
Okay.
I have only a few minutes and I gotta hit the road here. Are we comfortable with where we're leaving this one off, and what's the next step?
I think revise it as we've just discussed and take it to work study for more discussion.
Well, and
Unless
it's
the
gotta go
land
to
use.
planning commission too, right?
Yes, but normally we would want, I think, I don't know, should council be comfortable with that before we try to pass an ordinance?
I think we should brief council on it and take it to the planning commission concurrently because of the deadline we're working under.
Okay. I think that both of these issues, all of these issues related to types of housing should probably go concurrently. So that we're not amending the land use table several times. So there is one additional issue here, which I don't know if you have time to stay for this, Nick. But
I was
this
gonna
is
stick
one-
around for a few minutes, so yeah, go
Okay.
ahead.
Okay, so this is another thing that came out of this year's legislature about a city shall not prohibit indoor emergency shelters and indoor emergency housing in any zones in which hotels are allowed. Unless the city has adopted an ordinance authorizing shelters and emergency housing in a majority of the zones within a 1 mile proximity to transit. So it's either or. Either we have to allow emergency shelters and emergency housing in all of those zones, and hotels are allowed in commercial mixed use, downtown mixed use, gateway mixed use, commercial corridor, and commercial heavy. So we also have to allow emergency shelters in those zones, or we have to allow them in a majority of all zones within a 1 mile proximity to transit. And you'll see that I included a map in the packet, which shows that basically everywhere in the city, except for McCormick Woods, is within 1 mile of transit. So
And
that would
McCormick
include
Woods will
all
have
our-
transit, McCormick will have transit eventually, so really the whole city's gonna be within that radius.
Right, and so you would pretty much have to include at least some of your residential zones in there. You couldn't just exclude all of those, I think. So that's a decision that we're looking to you for, and what we had recommended was we just go ahead and say that we will go ahead and allow those types of shelters to be conditional uses in the same zones that we would allow hotels. We think that's probably the simplest and cleanest way to do it. We could go ahead and analyze, come up with a proposal to do it in all of the majority of zones, but it seems like this might just be the best way to move forward.
I agree.
Concur.
Okay, and you're comfortable with that being a conditional use for both types of shelter housing?
Yes. Fred?
yeah, I guess if we can make it conditional, sure.
Yes, we can.
I'm curious, what's the cost of a conditional use permit application?
It's like $1,200 plus the hearing examiner fee.
Okay,
And if SEPA is required, there's a surcharge for SEPA, like 300, I think.
Yeah, Carrie, I'm looking at your map on page 6. Yeah, that is
Mhm.
pretty much the whole city.
Yeah.
1 mile from transit, yeah, so.
Yeah.
It makes sense that we do the simpler of allowing it in the mixed use and zones where hotels, motels would be allowed.
Mhm.
Right.
Seems like
Okay. Okay,
Mhm.
then I will go ahead, and I will go ahead and prepare a revision to this table that incorporates the changes that we've talked about just for the permanent supportive housing. And we will bring this back then, as we've discussed, to both the planning commission and city council concurrently, so that we can continue to move this forward, because our deadline for incorporating some of this is September 30th. So we want to keep this moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Harry, does the 902 DeKalb discussion fit in with this as well? I didn't see it on the agenda, but I see the photos in the packet.
No, it's the next thing on the agenda.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
It's the congregate living issue.
Okay, I see.
Do you have time for that too?
I'm going to stick around at least for the first part of that, and then I'll jump out of here as soon as I have to go.
Okay. So there's a group of people who are interested in having a congregate living facility in the old church that's located at 902 DeKalb Street. That's at the southeast corner of DeKalb and Harrison. And I think they're forming a nonprofit called Amici House. And there has been some concern with the neighbors about what they're proposing to do here. I think some of the neighbors have the impression that this is going to be a homeless shelter or some type of halfway house. And part of the problem with this misunderstanding of their purpose is that we never actually have had a definition of congregate living in our code. And so I put this narrative in here from their conditional use permit application so that you could see what the applicants actually are proposing to do with the church and what their idea of congregate living is and what they want the house to be for. But what we're proposing to do is kind of convoluted. Why we want to do this is convoluted. They bought this building at I think at the end of last year, Nick. And
Yes.
yeah, and they were working on the assumption that it's zoned R2, which in our code right now doesn't allow congregate living not being defined, but they were going to request a rezone to R3 so that they could go ahead and pursue this congregate living idea of theirs. They were working for it in good faith. They were going to come in and do a CUP and so forth. The problem is they ran out of time. With the adoption of the downtown sub-area plan, which included this area, the downtown sub-area plan has been incorporated into the comp plan. So now, as of June, if they want to change the zoning, they also have to do a comprehensive plan amendment because they will have to amend the downtown sub-area plan. Unfortunately for them, what that means is we can only do a comprehensive plan amendment once a year. So they're going to have to wait till January of 2022 to even submit their application to amend the downtown sub-area plan. They have to, so they're going to keep holding this building that they can do nothing with. They can't even apply to do anything with it until 2022. And if our past comp plan amendments are typical, we're not going to have that annual amendment package approved until July, August. It's been as late as November of 2022. They're going to be holding on to that building for at least a year and not be able to do anything with it. So they're kind of in a pickle. This isn't what they expected. And so what they've asked us is, well, would it be possible if we simply made congregate living a conditional use in R2? That would be the simplest thing to do for them. And it's something that we are supportive of for the simple reason that we now actually have a chance to define what congregate living is. We didn't have that definition in our code. The definition that I put in your packet is something that we developed actually by going to Okanagan County, which we thought was actually a good one. And it definitely does not allow a homeless shelter, does not allow a halfway house, is not to be used for rehabilitation of criminals, and maybe is more like an old-fashioned boarding style house. And we hope is something that would put the neighbors more at ease. It still requires a conditional use permit. so that every facility of type like this that came into the city would be reviewed individually and its impacts would be mitigated individually. But we think that this is something that could be a great use in the downtown, something that could provide affordable housing, which is one of the uses that congregate living is supposed to provide. And yet it could be sure that, you know, this would be compatible and would not detrimentally impact the surrounding neighborhood. It would not be transient. Everybody would have to have a rental agreement for at least 30 days at a time. So this would not be a short-term Airbnb type of rental. Congregate living facilities would have to be within a countywide center as designated in the comp plan. So it would have to be in an urban area within a 1/4 mile radius of a transit route. So it would have to be very walkable. We would not be expecting every person within a congregate living facility to have a car. And it has to have 24-hour resident management that are responsible for the operation and maintenance of the facility. And I think most importantly, not providing medical care or social welfare services on site. So this is not meant to be some type of rehab facility, something like that. We also had those concerns from neighbors. So trying to make it very explicit what this is. This is simply a place to live. And I think by putting that definition in our code, by making it a conditional use, I think that by itself should reassure the neighbors who would be concerned that by allowing it in the R2, this could be a detriment to the neighborhood.
Fred, this is the project from Julie Kane. I think you talked to her, and you know, having talked to her, I'm fully supportive of this, not only project, but for the reasons you laid out, Carrie, about affordable housing.
Mhm.
And that it's, you know, their idea of some place where people are going to school, first job, et cetera, so they get a leg up. You know, I'm strongly in favor of this, and I love the idea that it's, you know, conditional use and that each one comes in individually. My, you know, my thoughts are, how do we make this happen so they can get moving on this? I think it would bode well for the city. And Fred, I know this is in your neighborhood, so I'm going to kind of let you speak how you feel about it. But even if it was in my neighborhood, I would be strongly supportive of this.
I'm supportive of it, and I didn't see this until now, so I do have a question about who wrote this, like on page 15 where it says parking. Is this something that they wrote, or did staff write this? Did the applicant write it, or did the staff write it?
They wrote everything except for the notes at the very top where it says city staff notes. I just wanted to
Okay.
explain what this was about, but this narrative is from the applicant that they submitted
Okay.
with their CUP application.
Okay, because I don't agree with their characterization of the parking in the area.
Abundant parking?
Pardon?
That it's abundant?
Well, they're saying that, yeah, it's underutilized offsite, and I don't quite agree with that characterization. Unfortunately, we had someone from the Kitsap Master Gardeners look at the park at Central, you know, the playground, as a potential Master Gardener site, and they felt there was not abundant parking for the Master Gardeners. So I think it's in one sense, there is a lot of parking, but it is already being used. During the daytime, there's all day parking on DeKalb next to the park that is used for 10 or 11 cars. So but I don't want to get into the weeds on this. In general, I would agree with Jay that I would support this.
One thing on the parking real quick. Nick, did you have, okay, he left. One thing that when we were talking with Julie, their idea is that some of the people will not have cars because of the ability to take transit and the ability to use the fast ferry and the ferry system. They're not encouraging cars because it's an added expense to the residents, you know, through insurance and everything else. So, you know, I agree with what you're saying, Fred, that may be a misnomer. Carrie, I do have a question. You know, you were saying that, you know, residents were speaking out. Do you know if they did an outreach to the community?
I'm not the current planner working on this project. That's actually been Jim Fisk, and he might be I could put him in touch with you to talk about that. I know that I've talked to Julie, and I think they've had some residents contact them directly to speak to her, and some residents have spoken to Jim. I haven't had anyone speak to me, so I don't know what exactly, if they've had formal outreach or not. I don't know. I've just kind of heard it through the grapevine that they've heard some concerns, and Jim has heard some concerns. I think at our front counter, people have come in, hey, what is this? You know, we hear there's a halfway house or a
Right.
rehab piece going in, and that's not what's going on.
Okay.
You know, and it's not to say that every congregate living facility is going to be like this, that it's targeted to young people, that it's, you know, going to provide job counseling and these type of support services. It could just be a place where people go to get affordable housing and live, and they don't have this cohesive program in place. We're not requiring it. But this one, I think, is specifically an example of something that would really be a benefit to our downtown.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
think-
so we're just trying to help these people, but also while we're trying to build something into our land use table and into our code that could encourage these types of facilities in future.
Well, I'm 2 thumbs up on this one.
I can tell you, Jay, that some neighbors were opposed to the prior use of the facility
Right.
being a warming center during the day,
Right.
which they felt attracted people that would sleep in their cars at night around the area.
Mhm.
So those neighbors are probably the most skeptical. But I think that, yes, this particular proposal is pretty reassuring. I don't know how they'd react to it because I haven't talked to them because there hasn't been anything official. But the neighbors would probably be, I know some of them are very supportive of this, so it would be a mix.
Scott?
I'm okay with it. I think what they've asked and what they've, I mean, I haven't read through the details, but it seems like they've made a cohesive argument about why we should support the change. And I don't have a problem with that. I think with the conditional use, we get to dive into it a little bit more, and that's where kind of the rubber meets the road. So I'm okay with it.
And if parking turns out to be a major trigger for the neighborhood, or if there's a study that shows the parking is not adequate, then having it remain a conditional use allows us to put conditions on its approval.
Cool.
To mitigate that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Then, were there any other questions about any of those items related to housing for the moment? Okay. Then I can move on to the last item, which is our Shoreline Master Program. The council approved the periodic amendments to our Shoreline Master Program in March, and we submitted those to Ecology and just got our comments back last month. Well, actually, I think in June. Yeah, and so we reviewed the comments that we got back. We only had a few requested changes from Ecology, which is nice. Most of those were related to, we need to make some additional changes to our SMP, pretty minor, about bringing them up to date with some things that are required for critical areas. We knew that our critical areas code was a little bit out of date in some ways. We need to update that with our comprehensive plan update, which is going to start happening next year through 2024. But some of them we need to go ahead and do now because they apply to critical areas within the shoreline jurisdiction, and Ecology is going to require that those be updated now. That's fine, I think. So that's most of what you see on the pages here about updating references to critical areas regulations, include them in the SMP, excluding sections of the CAO that are inconsistent with the Shoreline Management Act. All of these are simply bringing our SMP more into line with what's already being required in state law. So I don't think there's any problems here. However, we do have an issue with the very last thing that they were requiring of us about not allowing parking in the shoreline buffer. Normally, we agree there shouldn't be parking in the shoreline buffer. However, we sat down with Ecology last year with our specific Ecology representative, Misty Blair, and talked with her about, hey, in our downtown, specifically the area of our downtown Severia plan, it's all going to be redeveloped as part of this master plan or shoreline downtown Severia plan approval. And we're going to need to retain a lot of the parking that's down there that currently exists, a lot of which is already in the shoreline buffer. We're not going to get rid of all of it. And a lot of the uses that are going to be going in down there are what are called preferred uses. Those are water-oriented, water enjoyment, and water-dependent uses. The marina, boating uses. We're talking about putting a kayak rental in possibly as part of the community center, things like that. People are going to need to have shoreline access. We want people to be able to use our piers and docks and our parks. So having parking down there is and will continue to be an important part of the appeal of our downtown. We don't want to pull it all out. And they're pushing back on us about that. And while we agree that it's not a preferred use, that we want to try to keep it out of the buffer as much as feasible, we really do not agree that we don't really want to go with this request of theirs. And so we've been talking with them a little bit about that over the last week. We're going to have a Zoom meeting with their staff on Monday to discuss if there's a compromise that we can come up with about that. Possibly saying that now that the downtown I keep calling it a master plan, now that the Severia plan has been approved, we have officially designated areas where parking is going to go downtown on the waterfront. And perhaps we can just say that parking in the shoreline buffer is limited to those areas only, that we won't allow it to go anywhere else. Let's leave out the whole discussion of where it's feasible or not feasible. We're only going to allow it in those certain areas. It's going to be linked to the downtown Severia plan. And they're like, okay, we did talk to you about that last year, and we did kind of agree. So we don't have anything in writing from them, but I'm hopeful that we can work something out about that next week. However, I'm not sure. They may say no. So we just want some feedback from you three about how strongly do you think we should push back on this? How concerned would you feel if we had to take out the parking that's approved in the downtown Severia plan, if that had to be changed, if we had to amend the plan? How much of a concern is this for you?
I think parking is a major concern with downtown, always will be. My first question is, hey, do we have any emails from them? I mean, you're talking as verbal. Do we have anything that we could, in our discussion that says, hey, we talked about this, we emailed back and forth, we'd like to continue this as a variance. I'm not sure what the correct language would be, but parking is critical downtown regardless of what. So I would push back first, or ask nicely, I guess would be best.
Yes.
I'm looking at your email to Nick and Maria, and I think that's a regional approach. Parking is critical. Some may argue there's a shortage, or there will continue to be a shortage, but we've provided language that says if no other location is feasible. And so I feel like we're really attempting to meet them halfway. And so I feel like we should continue to pursue that approach.
Fred, you're muted.
I agree, and I was just trying to look at what they were proposing, like on a map, like what did we need and what did they suggest. I'm already not overly impressed with them because on June 21st they refer to it as Paulsbo.
I know.
And I thought, do they know the difference between Port Orchard and Paul's? I'm sure they do.
They do. They probably sent out comments on the same day.
I'm sure they do. I'm sure they do. But I was just, I was thinking, well, that's an interesting way to start off. But I agree with the other two. The parking is really very important and essential. I'm just not sure what they're suggesting though.
I like your words, Fred, that it's essential, strict, with the shipyard and everything else. That's a great word to use.
Yeah, we have to keep some of our parking down there and and I think they realize that, we're not proposing to allow more parking, to move parking into an existing shoreline buffer. That parking is already there. We're just not taking it out. And, I hope that by talking to them face to face, most of our communication has not been, that way. I hope that we can come to a reasonable compromise. So we just wanted to make sure that we had your support on that. And we will continue to push for that to remain in our shoreline master program.
Are,
Cool.
are you able to kind of summarize what the WAC speaks to in this? It says that we're attempting to comply with it, but is the WAC so clear that we're on the losing end of this argument?
Not necessarily. Parking is not a preferred use in
Okay.
the shoreline in general. But it is understood that parking needs to be provided to support preferred uses, which are the water dependent, water oriented, and I just forgot the last word. Oriented. Great. Now I'm gonna forget my
Water dependent?
dependent, thank you, my preferred uses. They realize that you have to have parking to support those. Those all can't be way outside of the shoreline jurisdiction in all cases. So what they're saying is that, well, parking being a non-water dependent use and non-preferred, you shouldn't have it there. And we're saying, well, but let's be real, it's not actually prohibited, it's just not preferred. And in this case, we're not saying we're going to put it there, we're just going to keep there what we already have. So please be reasonable and don't tell us to move it all out. Because when we redevelop all of these properties downtown, yes, as part of the redevelopment, we're going to be taking out temporarily parking that may be there, and it may be moved around on a property or on a group of properties, but those sites are already developed. They are not pristine property. Parking is already there. So we are just proposing to allow parking to go back where parking already exists. And that's what we want to explain to them. Maybe we need to run them through the downtown Severio plan again. They haven't looked at that since last fall. Maybe they need to understand the connections between that again and know that we're not trying to get away with new intense development in the shoreline buffer. Jay?
I don't know whether this argument would hold anything, but the tie-in, I believe, where we're talking about with, not only businesses, but also mass transit. Whether that's a valid argument because of the fact of the ferry connections, the number of trips that doesn't put on the road, both to Seattle and to Bremerton. I don't know if that holds any water, no pun intended, on that, but that would certainly be an argument that I would include if you see merit in it.
Thank you, Jay. That's a really good point that I hadn't brought up. That is that we have our transit drop off and parking right there, and our ferry departure right there, as right there in the buffer, right on the waterfront. And we need to
Right.
especially make sure that that's retained as well.
I thought of it because of Fred. So thank you, Fred, for being here.
I also wonder if they're taking this approach with all the SMPs that they're reviewing everywhere.
I imagine they probably are if they have parking in their shoreline buffer and they're not proposing to prohibit it.
Yeah, so I wonder if other jurisdictions are finding this as egregious as we are.
Well, we were the first one to turn in our SMP. So we're probably again first to respond to it. Aren't we lucky? So I don't know. How about the county? Has the county turned theirs in yet?
They have, but we haven't gotten a response yet.
Okay.
Cool.
Okay, well, that
All right.
provides me with guidance on that as well. So thank you.
Anything else for the good of the order?
Not
Good.
for me.
Okay, good meeting. Fred, you have some items coming up, I think that you asked us to look at. Very interesting article from New York Times.
How about the tree canopies?
And, I know that's one thing that, that land use is, or that we've talked about, with the trees. And, certainly start including some of those down the road And our next meeting is August 4th. I'm surprised we could actually agree on a date. It's awesome.
At 4 PM.
At 4
Right.
PM.
Any,
I'm sending out that meeting reminder the minute I get off. this- yeah.
I hand wrote it on my calendar because I'm old school.
Put it in my
Okay.
phone.
Yeah. Anything else?
Thank you, Carrie. Well done. Another good meeting that you've run and good
Okay.
information. Very well
And
done.
Fred, you have what you need for briefing next Tuesday?
Yes, yeah.
Thank you very much for doing that. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you
Take care,
all.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.